All right, so remember earlier in the year we learned about absolute value, and we learned that the absolute value is the distance any number is away from 0. So we had the example right here where you've got the absolute value of -3, and that because it's 3 units away from 0, that is a +3. And then we've got this example over here where we could have the absolute value of 4, and that is the absolute value of 4 is +4 as well. Remember, because when we measure absolute value and the distance away from 0, it always has to be a positive number. So the absolute value of -3 is +3, and the absolute value of +4 is +4. All right, so let's go ahead and take a look at simplifying expressions. So we're going to evaluate each one of these expressions, and notice how number 1 and number 2, how these do not have those absolute value brackets there. These are just the parentheses, and so what we have for number 1, it's like taking a negative, the opposite of a negative. And remember, we've learned earlier in the year too that 2 negatives make a positive. So a negative, or opposite of -4 is +4. Now if we took a look at number 2, we have 3 negatives. And so if I took 2 of these negatives, remember those are going to become a positive. But then if I look at this, what I have left, I still have a -6 left. So those 3 negatives actually end up just making a -6 when we're simplifying it. So our next two are dealing then with the absolute value. And so if I have the absolute value of -4, remember it's how many steps is it going to take me to get, or the distance it's going to take for me to get to 0. And it would take me 4 steps to get to 0. So the absolute value of -4 is 4 away from 0, so it's 4, a +4. And if we have the absolute value of +4, that too it takes 4 steps away from 0. So that is also going to be +4. So we can say that absolute value is always going to be a positive number because it's measuring distance. All right, so let's take a look at number 5. For number 5, we have negative absolute value of 8. So remember in the order of operations, we've got the please excuse my dear Aunt Sally. And the parentheses is the P, the exponents, then we have multiply and divide, and then the add and subtract. Well, in number 5, we don't have any parentheses. Let's move over to the exponents. So when you've got that absolute value, it's kind of at that level of the exponents, but we don't put all of those there. It would be the next thing that you would want to evaluate in there before you would do any adding and subtracting. So what that means then is that I have to evaluate this right here. I have to evaluate the absolute value of 8. And the absolute value of 8 is +8. And then I'm just going to come back here and I'm going to put that minus on there. So I'm going to have -8 or -8. Now, number 6, we have negative absolute value of -5. Now, I want to remind you that this is not the same thing as this. Because if I had 2 negatives here, that's a parentheses. The parentheses has no mathematical value. It's just taking and it's separating those 2 negatives. So this would in turn become a +5. But here I've got the negative absolute value of -5, and the absolute value actually has a value there. It's saying the distance away from 0. So I'm going to evaluate here first. I have to evaluate inside there saying, what is the absolute value of -5? Well, the absolute value of -5 is 5. And so I now still have this negative on the end here, so I'm going to place that back on here, giving me a -5. All right, for number 7, notice I have 2 negatives in the inside. Probably the best way to read this one would be the opposite of -5, and then the absolute value of opposite of -5. So remember, the order of operations is going to tell us that we need to evaluate everything in the inside here first. And so I'm going to evaluate these 2 negatives. These 2 negatives are going to become a positive because there's just a parentheses that is separating those 2 negatives. All right, so I've got now a positive 5. So I've got, what I have is I have the absolute value of 5. Well, we know that the absolute value of 5 is, it's 5 units away from 0. And so, and absolute value is always positive, so I'm going to have a positive 5 for my answer here. All right, number 8, we have negative 5 minus 4, and then the absolute value of that. So again, we're going to evaluate what's going on in here first, and then we'll take the absolute value of this one. So I have to take negative 5 minus 4. Remember, I'm 5 in the hole, and I go another 4 in the hole. And so I am then at a negative 9. So simplifying inside the absolute value symbols, I'm going to have a negative 9. And then now I need to simplify by taking, what is the absolute value of negative 9? Well, that is going to be a positive 9 because it's 9 units away from 0 on the number line. All right, so I have the absolute value of 6 minus negative 4 minus 5, or the absolute value of negative 4 minus 5. All right, so let's take a look here and let's simplify. I'm going to start by simplifying inside of here. I'm going to take and simplify this stuff in here before I do anything else. So I'm going to just take my absolute value of 6 minus, now I'm going to continue, I'm still going to have the absolute value, so negative 4 minus 5, I'm 4 in the hole, I go another 5 in the hole, I have minus 9 is equal to, all right? So now I can take the absolute value. I'm going to take the absolute value of 6, and I'm going to take the absolute value of negative 9. So right here, the absolute value of 6 is positive 6. And the absolute value of negative 9 is 9. So I'm going to just come back and I'm going to put my minus sign here. And then I'm going to simplify by taking, what is 6 minus 9? Well, 6 minus 9 is negative 3. So this right here would be our answer. All right, and for our last one, we have in this section, we have negative 2 times the absolute value of 4 times negative 3 plus 5. All right, so before I do anything, I have to, let's simplify everything on the inside of this absolute value first. So I'm just going to come back and I'm going to write my negative 2 here. All right, so I have 4 times negative 3, that gives me negative 12. And then negative 12, then now plus my 5, gives me a negative 7. All right, so now notice that we have that negative 2 and it's right next to an absolute value sign. So this does mean that we're going to be multiplying it. But before I can do that, now let's continue simplifying, and I can take, what is the absolute value of negative 7? Well, the absolute value of negative 7 is 7. So I'm just going to write, because I know that there's still a multiplication. That didn't change, but I just took the absolute value of negative 7. So now I have negative 2 times 7, and I'm going to get a negative 14. All right, example 2. Evaluate the expression when x is equal to 1 and y is equal to negative 5. All right, so anytime we have an x, we're going to plug in a 1, and anytime we see a y, we're going to plug in then negative 5. So let's start with this first one where I have 3, and I'm going to, and remember the number right next to the absolute value means we're timesing it, and I'm going to plug in my x and my y. So I have 1 minus 5. All right, so now before we can do anything, we have to simplify inside our absolute value. So I'm going to have 3 times, and I'm going to have 1 minus 5 is negative 4. And then now we need to simplify that. And so I'm going to have 3. And now when I take the absolute value of negative 4, I'm going to write the parentheses because I'm no longer going to need those. But I do need to still multiply. So the absolute value of negative 4 is 4. And then 3 times 4 is 12. All right, so let's take a look at the next one. Again, we're going to plug in our x and our y, and we're just going to take an absolute value of 1. Now we have to be really careful here because notice I have a minus right here, and notice I have a negative 5 right there. So that means that I'm going to have 2 negatives right there. All right, so I'm going to start by simplifying here. And I'm going to take 1 minus negative 5. So these become a plus, because two negatives make a positive. So 1 plus 5, that's going to give me 6. So I'm going to have the absolute value of 6. Well, the absolute value of 6 then we know is 6. All right, let's take a look at number 3. All right, so we're evaluating the expression when x is 1 and y is negative 5. So for number 3, I'm going to have the negative absolute value, and then y is negative 5. Okay, well, remember this is not like we can take the two negatives make a positive, because we have to take the absolute value of negative 5. So the absolute value of negative 5 is 5, and then I just have to place my negative back on the outside. All right, question number 4. We have x is 1, the absolute value of 1, minus the absolute value then of negative 5. All right, so let's start then by evaluating these absolute values. So I'm going to take the absolute value of 1 is 1, and I'm going to have my minus, and the absolute value of negative 5 is 5. So now I have, because I still had the minus between it, so 1 minus 5 is equal to negative 4. All right, so we have 2 more. Number 5, we have 3 times the absolute value of y plus 3 plus 5. And again, we're going to plug in these values. So we're saying y is equal to negative 5. So I'm just going to write 3 times, and then y is negative 5, and then I have plus 3, and then I've got this plus 5 at the end. All right, so for this, remember, we have to start inside the absolute value symbols to simplify first. So I'm going to take negative 5 plus 3, and that's going to give me negative 2. I've got the absolute value, and I have 3, and then plus 5. All right, so now we have 3 times the absolute value of negative 2. So I'm going to take my 3, and I'm going to write this, because remember that is a times, but I'm going to be taking off my absolute value symbol. So I have the absolute value of negative 2, and that's going to give me a positive 2, and then I have plus 5. So we have 3 times 2 is 6, plus 5, and then I'm going to be all done when I add those together, and I get then 11. All right, now for our last one, we are going to be plugging in an x, and remember the x is equal to 1. So I'll have negative 4 times 1 minus 5 plus 2. All right, so negative 4 times, what's 1 minus 5 is negative 4 plus 2. All right, so I have my negative 4, and now remember we're taking this off, so the absolute value of negative 4 is positive 4, now plus 2. And so I'll have negative 16 plus 2, and then that's going to simplify then to negative 14. All right, so in this lesson we took a look at how to simplify expressions with absolute value.